Meanwhile, the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa says the current rates have catastrophically failed the economy and burdened many working and middle-class people. Giwusa President Mametlwe Sebei joins us now for some reaction. A very good afternoon to you, Mametlwe. Thanks very much for your time. First, just your reaction to the Reserve Bank decision.
Nice to be here, Vio. I mean, we are seriously disturbed and strongly condemn the decision which it is a very cruel betrayal of the legitimate expectations of ordinary working and middle-class people who were awaiting desperately for relief from the Monetary Policy Committee, given the burden of the cost of debt service that is crushing and suffocating many people who are facing multiple crises, not only of cost of living, that is, further aggravated by the high interest rates, but also repossessions of, cars, of houses, of furniture, basically a wholesale looting and plundering of the working and middle-class people by, the financial, finance, sector vultures that are always waiting for the people to fall on hard times in order to restructure the debt or renegotiate the debt so that they keep them permanently in debt trap, or basically to strip them of their assets, which they've earned very hard, setting them back, again and again.
Well, the Reserve Bank governor says the situation calls, for caution and following economists ahead of today's MPC decision. This was to be expected. The majority said this would be the case because if you're trying to balance inflation risks, the global economic uncertainty, and our own domestic fiscal pressures, the situation calls for a walking off the tightrope, as it were.
Firstly, we reject the whole policy framework that masquerade as economic theory without meeting a rigor, really, of scientific test. That is to say, the empirical evidence to suggest that this interest rate policy is a way to combat inflation, which doesn't even make sense because most of our inflation is imported, and of course, ultimately down also to price gouging by monopolies that dominate our economy due to oligarchic conditions in many industries. And this is, testified by countless reports from Competition Commission, right? But also insofar as their whole policy is, tailing mainly the Federal Reserve, and they are trying to, basically set about differential between the interest rates in this country and many other countries with low interest rate like the US, Europe, Japan, where they try to attract hot money through what you call a carry trade. They are basically condemning many working class people in this country to devastating consequences that I've tried to lay out: the cost of living, the repossessions, the asset stripping, all of that in the service of the vultures in the financial market, the bankers, the speculators, and all sorts of interests that are swindling the country, mainly actually engaging what we call the currency exchange markets, but also many of them also involved in the rigging of the currency and manipulation of rand. You would know that most South African banks have been charged and found guilty in the US. The findings that have also been, cited by the Competition Tribunal in this country to say they need to be held accountable for rigging of the rand. So the idea that you'll have a monetary policy centered around pursuit of money of speculators who rig, short sell the currency in order to blackmail the Reserve Bank to raise the interest rate from which they profiteer at the expense of so many working class people, middle class people, but also small and medium enterprises, leading to devastating amount of liquidations as well as job losses. That is not a sound economic policy, in our view.
What though would you have done if you were in their position? Because the reality is that we are indeed in uncertain times, more uncertain times than we have had in recent history.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that South African Reserve Bank is merely operationalizing the neoliberal macroeconomic policy that has been pursued by the ANC at all levels in their, management of the economic architecture of the South African capitalism. And part of the consequence of that policy is that it has completely subordinated, right, South Africa to a domination of foreign-owned corporate monopolies, but also financial speculators that are engaged in many ways in colonial extractivism that undermine the foundations of the economy, has led to deindustrialization, that has created imbalances in the current accounts of the country, which they compensate by raising the interest rates in order to attract the hot money that does not solve the problem, but of course crush the working and the middle class people, right? It doesn't solve the problem because this is not a money that end up in the productive sectors of the economy, manufacturing, mining, construction, all of that. If anything, actually they keep and the very industry that are supposed to be building the economy and balancing it, as well as making it to create jobs and of course end poverty and unemployment in this country. Look at, for instance,
but what
the
would
impact
you
of these policies on the impact of this policy on the property markets, right? Look at the devastating impact they've had on a construction industry that has lost over 70% of its capacity, leading to over 250,000 jobs that were lost since 2016. Right? And I can go on and on.
But what I was asking was, with all that history, right, and that reality, what would you have done if you were a member of that committee today, with all that history that you've outlined? What would you have done on a day like today?
When the monetary policy that work in the interest of the working class people in this country, one is that the way to fight inflation, right, have price controls, which we used to have and we still have for a number of like oil and so on. But even that is still rigged in the interest of the big corporations in those industries and so on. You need price controls over food and other basic goods and services. And you need to make sure that you impose capital control to arrest the massive capital flights through, profit repatriations, illicit financial flows that are creating so much imbalances in the economy. We need to take banking industry, the finance capital, under a public ownership so that we have a public banking system and a financial industry that can mobilize the enormous amount of capital in this country to rebuild the economy, reindustrialize the economy, as well as fund a mass public works program to create millions of jobs in rebuilding the infrastructure, the clinics, the hospitals, the schools, the roads, the houses that we need, as well as making sure that we have industrial capacity that can create millions of jobs, as well as making this country not as dependent, not as exposed and vulnerable to whims in the global markets, particularly of the speculators that are making the South African rand so extremely volatile, precisely because of the weak economic foundations in the economy.
Well, let's leave it there for tonight. Mametlwe Sebei, who's the president of Giwusa, responding, of course, to the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee decision today to leave to hold the rate.